All right. Well, thank you very much for doing this, Sean. I'm super excited to read your book, College Girl Missing. I haven't had a chance to read it. I didn't realize it was out until like a week ago. And this is one of those cases, Lauren Spierer, that if a lot of true crime addicts know about this case. It's one of the big ones, and so I'm very excited to get to it. But for those that don't, for some reason they've been living in a hole and they don't know the Lauren Spierer case. Can you give us a brief little background on the case itself?
Sure. On June 3rd of 2011, Lauren Spierer had just finished up her sophomore year at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. And she was planning to get together with her boyfriend one evening. And at the same time, she was being invited up the street to a pregame party. And she ultimately decided to go up to the party, and she went out with a gentleman named Corey Rossman. Um, and a few hours later, she vanished. About 4 o'clock in the morning was when she was reported last seen.
So that's the brief, little bit of news that we've had since 2011.
Right.
Now, give us a little bit of background about yourself. Is this your first book?
It's my first book. I've been a journalist forever. I think over 30 years since college. I went to Northeastern University and studied journalism and
You work for
written
the Daily Mail now, right?
I work on the exclusives team, which is a national team that I work to break news on big stories around the country and fly around a lot and dig
Nice.
in, dig in. Uh,
Where else have you worked before Mail?
um, well, I started off at a small town paper in New Hampshire, then went to Washington D.C. and worked on the Arab-Israeli conflict
Oh, wow.
on Capitol Hill, and then went to the Middle East and worked from there. And then I came back to New York and started with daily journalism, just working for Gannett papers in Poughkeepsie,
Sure.
and then in the Journal News, and that's where Lauren Spierer, the girl who went missing, where she had grown up. And then after she went missing a few years later, I went on to the New York Post and became the police bureau chief there
Oh,
for
wow.
about 4 years.
What was it like
Um,
working for the Post?
it was chaos. I know, like on day one, when I arrived at work, my predecessor in the police bureau chief spot told me the job was sort of like crack, and he was happy to leave it behind because it's like an all-consuming thing covering the NYPD and breaking news in New York City.
Yeah,
And
I
so
bet.
suddenly I was like in charge of the coverage,
And
and
the Post does a lot of good work breaking some of the news or getting pieces of it that most people don't have. Same with the
right.
Daily Mail for that matter.
Yeah, the Daily Mail is great because I'm more of a solo operator. I get to and I have a good budget to fly around and do things that I wouldn't haven't had that kind of ability beforehand.
Is it mostly crime that you write at this point?
Mostly crime, yes. I mean, I do some just kind of entertainment kind of stories, but mostly crime, mostly what I like to do.
What drew you to Lauren Spiere's case initially? How did it pop
Um,
up on your radar?
well, it started with like a weekend shift at the Journal News in Westchester, New York, and I'm just kind of hanging around, and the bat phone rings, and it's a friend of Lauren's, who named Frank Moranti, and he was told by the family to reach out to the media because Lauren at that point had been missing for over a day. So he told me that she was out uh, with friends and never made it home. So we put up a story, and then 2 days later, I went to Indiana and started digging into it.
Have you always kind of been chipping away at it since then? Is it something that you've through the years gathered information and records and kept on top of, or was it something you had to like go back to square one for this book?
Well, in the early days, the couple days after she went missing, I was in Indiana and started from scratch. Figuring out where she'd been that night, reaching out to individuals, trying to figure out who had interacted with her. Ultimately, uh, narrowing it down to a few individuals and the last person, couple people to see her. And then, soon after, when I started reaching out to those people, then I got calls from their lawyers. Um, but I was the one who was able to break a lot of news early on, with um, naming the persons of interest and how they, what was known about their interactions with her that
Good.
night. So I kind of took it from there. And then I think at about the year mark, um, uh, I when the anniversary came around, I became closer with the family, Lauren's
Sure.
family. Early on, they weren't happy with the coverage. They wanted everything left to the police.
Yeah.
But as time went on, the case grew cold. They saw that I was kind of the lead reporter on it, so they started speaking to me more. So about the year mark, I sat down with them again in Indiana, and I met with their private investigators who they'd hired essentially to try and find out information that they weren't getting, answers they weren't getting from the police.
That's a, as a person who's written a couple true crime books too, and over the last couple years especially, it's kind of a fine line between old-fashioned reporting and getting the facts out there and letting the facts speak for themselves versus handling a story in a way where you're trying to be deferential to the family and to the people involved. How do you walk that fine line?
Well, that was a challenge, from early on when I was reporting about what happened that night. I've inevitably learned about some of the drugs that were in play that night, and the fact that she went out with this guy who wasn't her boyfriend and was trying to hook up with her, and how she had fallen, and there was video of her stumbling and with this guy Corey Rossman. Um, that was a challenge, I think, with the family. But I stick to the facts, and it kind of speaks for itself. And I think over time, um, the family understood that this telling the full story of that night was important. So they became, you know, accepted, I guess, that this kind of had to happen. So I've always been like an aggressive reporter to push all, what I considered relevant information out there. And
Yeah.
it is a challenge because yes, you have you know a a girl who's loved by her family and her friends, and you want to absolutely tell the story about who she was, the full story of who she was. But what happened that night was there were a lot of dark things happening.
At one point, did you realize you had enough for a book? When did you start thinking of moving from articles about the story to writing the definitive book about the case?
Um, yeah, so early on, about the year mark, I did that big story, which to this day, or at least before the book came out, stood as like the most thorough piece of reporting on the case. And at the 10-year mark, when the anniversary came up, people were still running that information and still running like video of me talking about the case about the 1-year mark. So that was frustrating. And then a lot of media over the years had gone down certain rabbit holes, and hey, did this person maybe play a role? That person maybe play a role. And there were rounds of news coverage, but nothing fundamentally changing, what was actually known about that night. So about the 7-8 year mark, after parting ways with the New York Post, I suddenly had uh, the opportunity to work full time on my own. And that was the case that remained unsolved, who I'd grown close with her family. And I asked them essentially for permission to revisit the case because it would take their cooperation and, um, to get started. So they greenlit it, at least from their perspective. When I started reaching out again to the private investigators, they, with the Spierer family's blessing, allowed me to sit down and go through all the files they'd collected over the years. So that became a new starting point for the reporting, and then I started going after, reapproaching witnesses and finding new ones.
The majority of true crime books that are published that are out there already are about solved cases. When you write about a solved case, it's a little easier, I think, because you have access to police reports that otherwise wouldn't be available to the public because of an ongoing investigation. You've got a nice ending of some sort. You can wrap things up. I love the unsolved cases, and I wish there were more books like this out there. What did you find particularly challenging? Were you afraid to write about an unsolved mystery, or worried that you wouldn't be able to get enough, or that it would open you up to dealing with lawyers and legal and things like that?
I think that was the great journalistic challenge for me, is that it was an unsolved case, and the police weren't talking, hadn't spoken for years. The private investigators had reached their own somewhat dead end, and so for me to be able to go at it in a fresh way, that to me was quite the challenge. I know that getting a book deal initially, finding a home for it was challenging because yes, it's much easier to get a book approved if it's a solved case and you could draw from court files and police files. But in this case, I didn't have that, so it was really
Yeah.
a grassroots reporting. I was doing a lot of fundamental things to find out what happened.
What were some of the more, when I'm writing a story, there are already, even a story that I think I know, there's always that moment where a new piece of information comes out, or a source leads me in a direction, or a new witness comes out, and you get goosebumps because it's like, oh my gosh, this might be an important piece to this puzzle that isn't out there yet. Can you tell me a story or two about something like that happened during your research into this book?
Sure. Um, I started piecing together after you read through essentially what the private investigators had gathered. You see these kind of 2-3 page reports that are just kind of two-dimensional answers to the certain questions that were posed, like, hey, uh, can you describe what Lauren Spierer was like at that pregame party, or did you see her at the bar she was at, or did you approach her on the street as she was like falling down and being carried up the street? And then you read about the what the individuals who were with her in those in that final hour had to say. I think that when I started drilling down into moment by moment of what happened that night, there was a point at 3 o'clock in the morning. She disappeared at about 4:15 in the morning. That was the last point in time she was reported seeing. But about 3 o'clock in the morning, um, I learned through a Bloomington police detective who had retired. Since the police force wasn't talking, I started reaching out to former
Those are great
members of
contacts
that
to
department,
get.
right?
That's very smart. That's very smart, you know?
Right. So I started door knocking these individuals, and
Yeah.
one of them who had reviewed the entire case file um, told me that at 3 a.m. Lauren was there was a snippet of video that was the last point that she'd been seen on camera. And so you have Lauren Spierer, who is sitting on a curb, and the guy she was with, Corey Rossman, was making a phone call. And that I never knew about.
Hmm.
So that got me pushing for, well, who could she have called? And I was able to get my hands on the phone records for Corey Rossman, and I learned exactly who he called. And
How
then
in the
it
world
became
did
like,
you, how did you get his phone records?
I got, I can't say, but
Okay,
you
that's
know,
fine.
it
So
was, it was quite interesting. Yes,
who did
to
he
look
call?
through. It was a girl, the long story short, um, early on, even this, nobody really tracked down this individual. There were assumptions of who it might be,
Yeah.
but I figured it out, and it was a girl named Brooke Bullens from Corey's hometown in Massachusetts,
How
like
did
4 years younger than him. Um,
how did they not run that down before? That seems like
uh,
an important piece, an
yeah, well,
important clue.
um, I know that the private investigators never did, were able to,
Yeah,
um, and I don't know for certain what the police may have done on that front. But when I
yeah.
finally tracked down Brooke Bullens, and yeah, it took a long time to finally get face to face with Brooke Bullens. Um,
What
you know,
she
she,
what'd she say? You have me on the edge of my seat.
okay. Well,
We're still gonna
she
buy
was
the book.
claiming she didn't recall what that conversation was about. She didn't. He calls her that night. She doesn't pick up. He calls her again the next day,
Okay.
and does have a conversation with her. She claims that she doesn't remember that conversation. So I went back and forth with her, and that's in the book.
Okay.
But after I spoke with her, her mom reaches out to me, and I speak with her, and the mom recalled a little bit about that time,
Interesting.
but she didn't really think of it. But she said that her daughter Brooke had told her, in those weeks after the disappearance, Brooke told her that you that Corey had told her to stay off the phone because the FBI might be listening in. Corey was concerned that the FBI was listening into his phone calls. So he didn't want Brooke openly conversing about anything related to the case. So that led the Brooke's mom to question, like, well, what were they hiding?
And it sounds very nefarious, but again, we know
Mhm.
drugs were involved that night. Do you think it was just he didn't want the information about the drugs to get out, or do you think there is more to that? Or do you have anything as far as evidence or circumstantial evidence?
From early on, Corey Rossman, through his attorney, had said that he had no memory of that night. So part of my reporting was to look at, okay, what do we know about Corey's interactions, and also Lauren's, in those final couple hours? And I was able to learn that Corey was, when they were approached by individuals, Corey was the one doing the talking, and Lauren was the one kind of staring into space, and
Hmm.
barely able to stand, even able to seemingly recognize a friend that she had approached at one point. But Corey, um, at least someone had his faculties about him, and he was interacting. So um, the whole question of whether he actually had amnesia or he's just kind of holding back information, I thought that was worth going after. Um,
Yeah.
so readers could look at this and decide how likely it is that he actually had no memory of anything that happened that night. There's a lot of points in this book where I was excited to bring this information to the public.
Good. Were there any other moments that just took you a hard 90-degree turn from where you thought you were going to end up?
One of my goals was to finally get the kids talking,
Yeah.
all of them. Um, and I started with her roommates in college who had never really spoken, and they went into great detail about their time with Lauren, and what they knew about that night. But the persons of interest, the last few people who were with her that night, young male students, um, I kind of saved that till the later in my reporting. And ultimately, I did get Corey talking, and I also got the last person who reported seeing her talking, Jay Rosenbaum. So finally having the opportunity to have them on the phone and say, well, what do you want to ask? And going back and forth with them, that was, um, that to me was new information. And, having all the other information that I reported on, I think, um, and presenting that again, it leaves allowed me to ask, more pointed questions, and then also to, assess what they were saying. Was it consistent with, other statements about that people made about that night?
Did you leave those conversations feeling that they'd been 100% forthright with you?
Uh, they were doubling down on uh, certain things, saying that they just didn't remember what happened in those final moments. So it became, you know, I had to rely somewhat on what, say, Jay Rosenbaum had told the private investigators over time, and his statements evolved to them as well. Um, I think um, Jay Rosenbaum. I think it's worth pointing out. While he was telling me he had no firm recollection of those final moments, he did recall a couple basic things that he repeated to me, that she walked up the street, and he believes that she was confronted by an individual at the corner, and he saw this dark shadowy figure or whatever approach her.
Hmm.
That's um, and he even named an individual who he thinks it was a, a serial killer named Israel Keys.
No, come
Um,
on.
right.
The
Corey said the
classic
same thing. Yeah.
the classic boogeyman of all cases right now, you
Right.
know.
A guy who has long been dead, and um, who I learned, there was no indication that he was in anywhere near that region that night.
Oh my God. That's just it's almost just a lack of imagination there, more than anything else. That's
Right.
insane.
And you
Um,
you asked me, just generally speaking, um, about major revelations. I think that after all these years, 13 years now, important to see, what the evidence is, but where there is still a lack of evidence. And at this point, there's Lauren, we know, ended up in a townhouse complex with Corey Rossman. Corey had a roommate named Mike Beth, and two doors down, Jay Rosenbaum. Uh, and Jay Rosenbaum had a visitor named David Blesnak. Um, and those are the four individuals that we're talking about. I think there's not, all these years later, there's no indication that she ever made it out of that apartment complex alive. There was no
you,
video of her leaving. Not that there were no video cameras on that particular street, but around the corner, if she were to have walked around the corner, a video camera would have picked her up. There were no witnesses who saw her after that moment that Jay Rosenbaum says she walked out that door.
a couple things on that, along that line. You know, the old saying of, two can keep a secret if one of them's dead. It would be pretty difficult, I think, for four people to keep a secret for all this time. But do you think it's possible that something to that big, because over time, people talk, they get married, they tell their spouse, they get divorced. That spouse now has, leverage and all the reason to, talk bad about that person. Do you think it's possible though that a secret that big could be kept that long?
Um, I I'm a I stick to the facts. The fact is that Lauren didn't actually disappear. Something happened, and there are three theories out there. One is that she never made it out of that townhouse complex, that she may have OD'd or died from injuries. She had a heart condition. Another is that she did make it out, and her boyfriend was looking for her and caught up with her at that point. And then the third is that she was randomly picked up off the street, if indeed she made it out of the townhouse complex. I definitely went into dug in more into the boyfriend. And
What's your take on his personality, his credibility?
well, I think it's important to look at how they all behaved in the immediate aftermath, and also leading up to that night. Jay, the boyfriend, his name is Jesse Wolf. He was his actions that morning were to, call up the friends and try and find out what he could. And later in the day, he was the one who informed the family and that Lauren was missing, and he's also went into the police station. So we have a lot about his interactions with.
So he's doing
and-
all the right things there.
Yeah, and there are people who actually interacted with him who find it very hard to believe that he could put up that kind of effort and interact in that way if he actually was covering up something. The boys, could they have kept that secret? Jay Rosenbaum, Corey, Mike Beth, David Blesnak. The question becomes if one of them were to share a piece of information, that all of them would essentially go down. And
it's important to note.
There are some people who believe that yes, in fact, if you're essentially saving your own existence by keeping this secret, it'd be it's a secret that they would have to keep. But obviously I went at the book with an eye toward, putting all the information out there, letting readers judge it. And if there are people in their circles, as you said, like a spouse or a best friend who heard something from them early on, you'd think that one of those individuals, it only takes one, would crack at some point.
Yeah, and it's important to note at this time nobody's been charged in this disappearance. And have you ever even had has there been a suggestion that there was a grand jury at any point did they ever try to seek an indictment against anybody?
No, there's no indication of that. At about the 2-year mark after she went missing, the Lawrence family took the last boys to see her that night, known to see her that night, to court and sued them, trying to force information out of them.
I saw that. It was all dismissed eventually, correct?
Yeah, that was all dismissed. You had no, essentially no body, no hard proof of what happened.
That's another piece of it that I was going to ask you about. It's people see on CSI and Law and Order all the time, where you get away with hiding a body, but it's really hard to hide a body. Where do you have without naming any individuals or anything, but do you have a theory as to what might have happened to Lauren's body?
If indeed she never made it out of the townhouse complex alive, there were dumpsters outside. There was a construction site across the way. The sanitation would have come at about 5 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, that day they were scheduled for pickup, huh?
And would have gone if indeed there was a pickup of a body, covered up in a dumpster. It would have been taken to a transfer station about 6 miles away, and then it would have been transferred to another, facility, like I think 60 miles away from that in Terre Haute.
Have they ever searched?
Indiana, and they took a couple months after the disappearance, they did go to Terre Haute, and they described that as people have described that as someone like searching for a needle in a haystack, and
Yeah,
it
sure.
was almost no shot of finding an individual within.
Wow. Um, so what are you hoping to accomplish with the book, and how has it been received in the months since it's come out?
Well, what I was hoping for is that this brings the case to the present. I mean, it's been 13 years since Lauren went missing. Um, People were up until the book were still kind of rehashing the early reporting, and there was no original reporting to that point. So I think having it front and center in a book where people could pick it up, and every reader could learn, you know, just about everything that is known on the case, more than anyone in the early days knew, um, is important. So, but one of the big measures I saw was that people actually read this thing, and I'm happy to say that it's been on the New York Times bestseller list for 4 weeks.
Has it kicked up some new contacts and leads for you already?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've had various people reach out to me, and no core detail that goes to that night, but a lot of interesting calls and texts, and even from family members of at least one of the persons of interest, and
Interesting.
then people who were part of Lauren's life early on, who weren't talking beforehand, had reached out to me since. So there's more coming out there, but now we're almost 2 months since the book's launch, and I still have high hopes that this will continue to spread. And
Any threats since it's come out?
well, certainly some anger, but the individuals who um, may be like you have the persons of interest. I haven't um, heard directly from any of them.
Mhm.
Um, think overwhelmingly positive so far, but again, the overarching mission of all this is that this case gets solved, and so to me, it's still open, and I'm happy to see that people are talking about the case again.
Would you give me a call if you get breaking news that this thing's going to be solved? We'll get you on again.
Yes, absolutely, and
All right.
believe me, I'm not stopping here.
Okay, good, good. All right. The book is College Girl Missing, available wherever you get your books. It's on audio, right? You got an audio book and ebook and
Yeah, the audiobook's coming out in a few days.
oh, great.
It's on, yeah, Kindle and hard
I'm sure
copy.
that'll end up on the bestseller list too. People love true crime audio. Um,
Yeah.
so best of luck with it. Thanks so much for your time.
All right. Thank you very much, James. Appreciate it.